So, I have been meaning to do this for some time, and it's been the case for a number of reasons, but the main one being that this subject that I am hoping to discuss in this format is one that's quite interesting, actually. To myself, it is at least. But I do know that, or at least it seems that there's a growing number of people who actually share this interest, which is a good thing. When I sat down initially in order to sort of figure out what would be the best way to structure this, I did think about making a single video on this topic. But then I ended up deciding against that and thought that what might be best actually is to have this split into two parts. And so that's what I've done. So this video will be part one, in which I would hope to discuss this particular subject and do so by referring to a particular book, a book that I have right here. It is very likely that I would have included the name of the book in the title of the video, so chances are you know what book I'm referring to. And as a kind of summary then of this first part, what I'm hoping to do is discuss or present, in a sense, what we now refer to as the pre-modern conception of the world and the education that followed from that, and also look at the modern, which in effect is the postmodern conception of the world, and the education that followed from that. So this would be a kind of juxtaposition between those two. And then in the second part of this presentation, what I'd hope to do is consider the implications of both of those views in a way, again, referencing or referring to this book and what the book suggests that may mean for us. So this is what we're doing. And so I do not know how long this will end up being, and that is simply because, again, the nature of this discussion. But I do hope that those of you who are interested will naturally have an easier time sticking around and maybe even enjoy your time doing so. I think that's a good thing, and it would be something preferable. And just so that I am not taking up any more time, I would like to get into it straight away. So what I'm hoping to do is go over or review this book. This is C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. It is very likely, especially if you have clicked on this video, that you have read this book or maybe you know of it. I believe the book is about 80 pages, so it's relatively short. But it is safe to say that it packs a serious punch. That is because it is incredibly dense, and the message it conveys is prescient and likely more relevant today than when the book was originally published, which is why I thought it to be a good idea that we actually spend some time thinking about it. And though I have seen it actually being reviewed and discussed more and more, it does seem to me that overall it has remained kind of unknown and undervalued in a sense, in a peculiar kind of way, really. Though I can foresee how some of you may straight away disagree with what I've just said and remind me that the National Review, in their list of the 100 best nonfiction books of the 20th century, actually ranks this book number 7. And that is indeed a fact and something I am well aware of. I am not here to be arguing about facts. If anything, that is very much in the spirit of this discussion. But despite all of that, my claim remains that the book is somewhat unnoticed. That could be the case for a number of reasons. I mean, you could say that it is somewhat inaccessible. It certainly requires persistence, really, when it comes to trying to really dig into the subject matter that it covers, which is something that I am hoping that we get to do today. But this difficulty should never be something that stops us from understanding important expository works, and I do believe that this is one of those, and one that deserves our attention, actually. Also, I should say that my aim today would be to discuss this book as a single work of philosophy and without concerning myself too much with his thinking in a more broader perspective, say. That is, despite me having the utmost respect and reverence, really, for him, as I do believe him to be a tremendous writer and someone who, at the same time, is perhaps himself undervalued. maybe not that much as a writer, but maybe very much as a thinker. And I do believe that this book is actually a good example of that. And so in this video today, we can have let my adoration be irrelevant. We can just put that to the side, just so that we can focus on the text itself. I think that's a good way to go about things. Also, before I've continued any further, I should say, if it wasn't obvious by now, that I am very much an amateur when it comes to making videos. I am just recording this on my iPad, so I do hope that the quality is good enough. I thought that was worth mentioning. But anyways, and back to the book. So, as far as the main two arguments that I would hope to discuss, or points that I would like to think about that are present in the book, amongst many. And the very first one we actually find in the subtitle of the book, which we find on the first page. I can see this is mirrored there. And it reads as follows: Reflections on Education with special reference to the teaching of English. So why would that be the subtitle of the book? So, in a sense, we straight away understand that Lewis will be concerned with the modern, or with the current state of the education system, which he saw to be a system that perhaps intentionally or unintentionally indoctrinates students into a kind of relativist perspective of the world. And this has particular consequences. Lewis himself was a scholar and a teacher, so naturally this was something that was of his interest. And as far as the second point, which will be the main point, and overall, the abolition of man is ultimately about the objectivity of value and what happens if we deny that objectivity of value. The book itself is very much both a defense and a prediction of that. And what it does incredibly well is paint this picture really of this only natural path of this denial, which is to embrace subjectivism, and how it is exactly that is what ostensibly leads to the abolishment of our own human nature. So in essence, that's what the book is about. What Lewis does really, in a way unmatched, is defending the fact that moral value exists outside of our subjective preferences, and that we do not confer value upon the world. We rather identify it in the world. We discover value as opposed to invent it. Moral law, then, is not something that you can simply just reason yourself to, but you rather reason your way from it. That is because moral law is a starting place. It is a premise as opposed to it being a conclusion that you can pursue, in a sense. And all of this we actually see in the book, and this is the defense that Lewis gives of objective value. The prediction we can see in what we can foresee if we are to adopt this subjectivist view, that there's no objective value out there, and we can simply just make it up and project it just out of our own preference and choice, really. Lewis would say that if that is indeed the case, we are then on a very short route of self-destruction, which is why we have this title of the book. That is because by the very embrace of that stance, this subjectivist stance, all that we do is deny what is the most essential part of our own humanity. And so, well, clearly we can see how all of this becomes of very practical importance to us and to the way we view ourselves, and also to the way we live amongst and together with one another in societies. That is because our societies are informally organized by our cultures and traditions. Though you can argue about that, because a culture can be quite delineated, really, and also more formally organized through our politics. And we can see where and this would actually remind of the saying about politics being downstream of culture. And we can extend that a bit further, actually. We can say that what precedes culture is belief. Belief that is generated by perception. Much of that is driven by necessity and choice, which itself is generated by value. And so we live in a world of value, we could say, which would be part of the phenomenological experience that we have of reality, meaning reality is not only defined by and described by its material aspect, but there's also our experience of the material, which will be a separate topic, really. Now, with this denial of objectivism, this is what leads to a suffocating and shriveled world, really, of competing subjectivism that is now expressed in equally valid opinions. This is a world now that is devoid of value and truth, which is exactly what serves as the common ground for man's relationship with himself as well as his relationship with others. Without that common ground, we're left with no practical way for establishing a commensurate truth, and also no practical way for establishing a commensurate mode of action. And clearly, those are crucial, or that is crucial for us. And in order to bring all of this back to the ground and into context, we cannot overlook how Lewis's forecast is absolutely fascinating, really. And the book is deeply prophetic in that way because his prediction of globalism is remarkably incisive and accurate and clear. Because even when he wrote the book in 1944, he somehow managed to see this world and this interlocking mechanism, really, between technology and telecommunication that all of a sudden now creates a single economic and political worldwide system. And I cannot bring myself to understand that kind of foresight, and how, again, he saw the emergence, really, of this transnational elite that rules over nations and cultures and customs and traditions that all of a sudden now have to submit themselves and their, again, their nations and customs and cultures and their historic practices and identity to the protocols and norms of this new aristocratic elite that rules now. And we can take an example of that from today, which would be the sheer size and power of corporations that are in many cases richer and more powerful than nations. Lewis managed to see all of that pre-internet. Now, and luckily, he did also have a cure to this diagnosis of globalism that he gives us, which was it was to go beyond or past or post-global, which in effect meant to go pre-global. That is because by going back to the traditions and customs of the past, we return to this notion of encountering eternity, and therefore every day is renewed. That is because eternity involves the past, the present, and the future. The alternative to that would be to dismiss the past and dismiss history, and only give privilege to the present in view of the future. Or, in other words, this would be to honor what we know as the myth of progress, which is really this idea that the present will always be better than the past, and that the future will always be better than the present. This is an idea with validity, but there's some flaws there, as one of those unintended consequences is life itself really being confined in this perpetual and everlasting present moment. I believe Marx actually has a term for this, which he uses in a different context, but he refers to this as the end of history. And we are also reminded by Orwell's quote, and how every record has been destroyed and falsified, and every book has been rewritten, and every date has been altered, and this process continues day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped, and nothing exists except the endless present in which the party is always right. And I know this is dark. Unfortunately, part of this description is maybe not too dissimilar or too much to the world that we actually find ourselves in today. I mean, how many of us would actually look at the news, say, from a week ago, or maybe even just 2 days ago, if you are hoping to be updated to what's going on around you? It is only now that the most recent update is what's valid, and what's better than that even is the constant live feed that we can tune into. Now, Lewis and many others would make the claim that we ought to return to a conception of time that involves eternity by connecting us to our past, and that it is only through adopting this conception of time that we will always be renewed for a vibrant and flourishing future, and that way we can live faithful and truthful lives in the present. But there's this fundamental distinction, or this fundamental shift in understanding that took place towards the end of the 19th century between the classical and the modern conception of the world. So, the classical view would posit that the world, or the universe, is one filled with objective ideals of divine meaning and purpose. So, these would be ideals such as truth, goodness, beauty, justice, liberty. This doctrine of objective value is something scholars refer to as cosmic piety. And this was something that was very much ubiquitous, as in it was to be found everywhere really in the ancient world, pretty much up until that 19th century. Cosmic piety was this universal conception of the world that everything around us is filled with divine meaning and purpose, and therefore is being part of the world. All of us are born into a world of divine obligation. Because of that, we are obligated to conform our lives into a harmonious relationship with this divine meaning and purpose, so that way we can thrive and flourish and be all that we can be and live life to the fullest of fruition and delight, and that way being all that we're meant to be in a world of divine created order. And so, naturally then, the central question becomes this: how does man bring his soul into alignment with those highest of principles? And historically speaking, the answer was this: that this is done through the developing of the correct thinking about the world, which is the correct understanding of this divine meaning and purpose around us, and also through the developing of the correct sentiments towards the world, which is the correct kind of loving it. So, the correct knowing it we call wisdom, and the correct kind of loving it we call virtue. And so, what we have now is these two, which are wisdom and virtue. These are now the two key components of this truly human education, because it involves how to teach the student to understand and discern the divine economy of goods that is in all things, and also teaching him how to love those rightly. So I hope this is clear and it makes sense, and we can use an example actually, and we can use the apple that I have there. It's perfect. So imagine that this apple is not there, but is maybe on the end of a roof of a very, very tall building, and there's also a puppy there. So the apple and the puppy are on the very end of that roof, and you have about 5 seconds to react in order to save only one of them. As much as it might be okay to love and to value an apple because it is nourishing and can provide you sustenance, you somehow know that the wise and the correct and the virtuous thing to do in this situation would not be a matter of opinion. And that is because you possess the capacity to perceive their value as it relates to a particular objective measure. And this is a calculation that you somehow do in relation to this objective measure. I hope this paints the picture. Now, and in order to continue, wisdom is now the faculty that we develop in order to discern value in this divine economy of goods, after which I now need to align my love or my sentiments to that. This would be what Augustine would call ordo amoris, which is the ordering of our loves. And this whole idea actually is not something that we find in Lewis for the first time. If anything, he actually refers to both Plato and Aristotle and their views on education. And he specifically actually references Plato, where in the Republic, Plato actually describes the educated or the well-nurtured youth, who would be one who can see most clearly whatever was amiss in ill-grown works of nature or ill-made works of man, and how with a just distaste he would be able to blame and hate the ugly, even from his earliest years, and be able to give delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he can become a man of gentle heart. All of this he does before he is of an age to reason, so that when reason at length comes to him, then bred as he has been, he will hold out his arms in welcome and recognize her because of the affinity that he bears to her. So again, this is an old idea, but all in all, and in summary, for as long as our civilization and culture is built around this notion of the existence of these ideas, the civilization itself becomes a material expression of this meaning and purpose, and the educated person is one who can fulfill this cosmic piety in terms of understanding this divine meaning and purpose inherent in the world around him, really. This is again the acquisition of wisdom. And this person would also embody that, in a sense, embodying their desires and actions in accordance to that wisdom, which is again the acquisition of virtue. That was the classical view of the world. Now, as far as the education that follows from that, we receive that through the classical liberal arts, which were the trivium and the quadrivium. Those now become the mediators of this divine meaning and purpose that's around us. So, with the first one, the trivium, it taught general grammar, formal logic, and classical rhetoric. And it is now the education or the tool that makes it possible for us to see the world rightly in grammatical ways, also see the world rightly in logical and dialectic ways by reflecting the logos, and also seeing the world properly in rhetorical ways, in speaking beautifully and convincingly and persuasively. The quadrivium, which is the second part, it focused on arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And it was the second part of this education, as it allowed us to discern the mathematical proportionality that's there in the world, which is number in the abstract. Also the geometrical aspect that's in there in the world, which is number in space. It would also allow us to discern the musical beauty and harmony and symphony of this created order, which is number in time. And lastly, it would allow us to view or understand the astronomical view of this created order that's there in the universe, which is number in both space and time. Now, these are now the 7 lenses through which we understand the world around us, and the Western canon is our contribution to this project, which is what allows us to align our loves to what's truly beautiful and desirable. And again, this is an abbreviated version, but that was in a sense the classical view of education. Now, in contrast, the modern view is very different because the modern mind develops a very different view. It does not see the world as one filled with that objective meaning and idealism that we have been talking about. It sees the world as purely just chemical and biological and physical and mathematical causal laws, and simply as just pliable subject matter. Knowledge has now been redefined solely in terms of scientific rationalism in this view. The world now is devoid of meaning and purpose, simply because there's no meaning apart from what I choose to impart onto the world. Nature itself is blind, and beauty is a subjective category that I impose upon purely natural and biological chemical processes. And we actually make the mistake in thinking that truth or beauty actually exists out there as opposed to it residing within us. Man now is no longer interested in aligning himself with those objective and highest of principles. Instead, man asks that same question, but in an inverted fashion. The question now is, how do I conform the world to my own desires and ambitions? That's the question now. And so we can see how wisdom and virtue are no longer useful here, because the highest value has been ascribed to the total and skillful utilization of the mechanisms of manipulation and control, construction and deconstruction of the material world, mainly through science and technology. Those are our tools for that. And of course, those are advances that have undoubtedly brought a tremendous value to our lives. Lewis does not suggest that we are to rid ourselves from those, But in his view, technology is to serve as a servant that seeks to understand instead of a master of control. So, from these two fundamentally different conceptions of the world and human nature that we have described, it only follows that the education must also be conceived differently here. In one, it meant that education was the acquisition of wisdom and virtue, and in the other, it meant acquiring skill and technique, manipulation, and specialization, really. And the book actually it it famously starts with a scene at a waterfall that's visited by two groups of visitors, one group describing it as sublime and the other group describing it as pretty. And it is that very scene at the waterfall that is it's very much representative of this conflict and of this clash between these two worlds that we see now, one that is fundamentally moral and the other that is fundamentally mechanistic, one that is filled with wisdom and the other is guided solely by scientific rationality and perspective. These two worlds are incompatible. One will win and the other one will lose. Lewis says actually how in this view how the world of facts without one trace of value and the world of feelings without one trace of truth and falsehood, justice or injustice, these two confront one another and no rapprochement is possible. Now, as a way to continue and discuss the education in the modern world, what we see through the Enlightenment is a new way of knowing the world that takes over, and I will very much simplify a lot of this and shorten it just for the sake of brevity, as I do not and cannot go into the history and just the way this is normally taught, which is just this general view of the fall of Rome in the 5th century and how that is what plunges the West from classical civilization into a kind of cultural darkness now. And what we see then for the next 1,000 years is the church encouraging superstition and stifling intellectual freedom and suppressing scientific inquiry. But then now with the renaissance of classical learning, reason was again set free and science was discovered again and faith was now left behind as we have marched into a new world of scientific wonders. And maybe more towards as we continue into the 17th century and after the treaties of Westphalia and the formation of nation states, there's an interesting bureaucratic process actually that takes place. This is known as the nationalization of the universities. This is where churches are no longer in control of education in the universities. Governments are now taking control of universities with the intent of controlling education. And together with the technological progress and development that was happening at the time, knowledge now becomes redefined in terms of method, and namely that is the scientific method. It became very much commonplace to put forth the notion that anything that flunked the scientific method or anything that was impervious to it, like meaning or love or purpose or God, all of that was now to be excluded from the realm of what could be known. And as we can see, this is the emergence of a new conception of knowledge and man's understanding of himself or his human nature, of the world itself, and his place in that world. So what we see now is that it is science then in this continually developing technology that is what provides us with this one true way of knowing, really. And again, I have very, very crudely simplified this, so I hope I am forgiven for skipping and missing many technicalities and details of many of those events that have taken place. But my goal was just to describe how our definition of knowledge has then evolved. We can also see how it is this technological progress that is ostensibly and eventually what leads to the Industrial Revolution, which is then what ends up leading us to the globalization of the world. Now, what is very interesting here to recognize is that by changing the conception of knowledge, we actually change the conception of the world. Modern man now no longer believes in a world that's filled with divine meaning and purpose, because wonder has now been replaced by skepticism. In in this world now, the world has no inherent meaning apart from what we place in it, or on it really. And this way of seeing the world became more and more prevalent, really, very much in proportion to the technological advancement that continued on into the 18th and the 19th century. Because, again, modern man has asked the question, how do I conform this meaningless nature to my own desires and ambitions? And the answer was that we do this by tapping into those mechanisms that operate by the dynamics of power, which were namely science, technology, and the state. But those are now completely unhinged from any moral limitations, because morality or objectivity has now been fully redefined out of existence. We can see how our modern education has made us believe that to be educated is requires the dismissal of what's permanent and enduring. And so I have been talking for a while, and I know that, but I do hope that all of this makes it easier to see that the classical world is a moral world, and the modern world is, by its nature, manipulative. And that is because the fundamental question here is, how do I manipulate reality and nature? And again, that is done by using the tools that are available to me. And the ultimate aim in this world is the ultimate control of the physical and material and immaterial reality, really, to my own desires. But what's crucial to understand, really, is this, that if we are to enter into a world that has the total control and manipulation of nature at the very heart of its self-conception, and because we, meaning the humankind, is part of nature, eventually what that inevitably leads us to is the total control and manipulation of our own human nature in a way that is disconnected and divorced from any view of objective truth and reality. Now, could it be said that this is the operative standpoint of the relativists of today? Of those social constructionists to whom reality is nothing but the way we refer to it? Those who would claim that both that gender is a social construct, but also that the category of gender doesn't even exist. Anyways, and back to the conditioners. In order for them to govern this world effectively, they do not just manipulate reality to our own desires and ambitions, they also manipulate our desires and ambitions. This is why, actually, the first chapter of the book is named Men Without Chests. And it is because the chest, or the heart, is the seat of our human essence. Lewis again refers to Plato and his vision of the rightful king as the one who governs by his executive, and how it is in the same way that it is reason in man that must rule the mere appetites by means of the spirited element. The head rules the belly, which is our natural instinct, through the chest, which is the seat of magnanimity. By being fully integrated this way, emotions are now organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. The chest then becomes this indispensable liaison officer between what's cerebral man and visceral man. And it may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man, for by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by his appetite he is mere animal. Lewis also describes this as the tragic comedy of our situation, because we continue to clamor for those very qualities that we have rendered impossible. He says that in a kind of ghastly simplicity, we have removed the organ but demand its function. We make men without chest and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor but are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. And this is the end of the first chapter, and this has already been much longer than I thought. And I do hope that it has been really interesting. I'm not sure whether there's anyone still watching any of this, but it has been fun actually doing this. And we will continue all of this in the second part of this video.